Hi, Danny. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well, Charis. How are you doing?
Very good, very good. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to me.
My pleasure.
So for anyone who's not familiar with you or your work, you are a true master of all trades. You're a photographer, you're a filmmaker, curator, educator. So I wanted to kind of start at the beginning, and I was hoping you could talk to me a little bit about your journey with photography, because I know you started pretty young, right? You started at
Yeah.
14, and
Yeah,
your
but I
dad.
thought I started young, but it turned out everybody else in Kamoinge started when they were 9. So, but actually, I started earlier, but it wasn't serious. I started, I guess, around the same time when you're a kid and your parents give you a camera.
Hmm.
But I didn't take it seriously until my father put a darkroom in the basement.
Okay.
You had a camera, but you weren't looking at it as photography. And then around the same time, I started to go to art school. So all of a sudden
Okay.
I started looking at as an art, and also because it offered an opportunity to make art without having to work. Because in art school you learn how to sculpt or you learn how to paint, but painting with oils was just too hard, and acrylics wasn't really that popular when I was a kid. So it's kind of interesting how you fall into it because of the kind of technological convenience of it all. But my father put a darkroom in our house, in our basement, when I was about 14. He was an amateur photographer, so he was actually my first teacher of photography. And of course, you get addicted to the magic, the initial darkroom magic that everybody talks about, seeing
Hmm.
that image come up on a blank piece of paper, and then all of a sudden you're kind of hooked for that too. So I learned there, and then when I went to high school, I went to Arts High School in Newark, and above it was a Newark School of Fine and Industrial Arts. And someone who was teaching photography there, my brother took a photo course with him, and I sat in on the course. So I still can't remember the name of the instructor, and I need to go back and figure it out. In fact, I probably will, because we're doing a film on Newark, and I want to have to find out who taught, and I can find out who was teaching at the time too. But after that, I went to Arts High, and I became really formally interested in art and being an artist for a career. So it
Got.
was but it was all introduced because my father put the darkroom in the basement, and because I went to art school at the time. And even though photography wouldn't be something they would teach as art in an art school at the time, they were still teaching painting and drawing and sculpture, but also teaching. It was Arts High in Newark. They were teaching music and art too. So I went to school with a lot of famous musicians too, who become famous. But then when I went to college, I studied photography with Ralph Hattersley at Columbia. And he was not known for his photography, but he was known for his criticism and for his understanding of photography. So it was really interesting to do that. And because he liked my work and we got along as just kind of friends, he introduced me to Lisette Model, and I studied with Lisette Model at the New School for Social Research too. And so I studied with her, and we also became friends. I used to go visit her when she lived in 7th Avenue South. I met her husband, who was also a painter. Then after that, I went to NYU's Graduate Institute of Film and Television to study filmmaking. And they gave us still photography. They were trying to base the school in the European model, the models that you find in film schools in Prague or in Paris at the Sorbonne or in Italy. So they were trying to have a kind of full education for filmmakers. And part of it was still photography and photochemistry. So they taught us still photography in two different senses. They taught us the technique of still photography, and our teacher was Paul Caponegro, who's a kind of well-known American photographer too. And the ones who taught us photo history was John Sarkowski and Peter Brunel. They were the heads of the photo department at the Modern at the time. And probably the biggest influence is Sarkowski, at least, in terms of having people look at photography as a fine art in terms of the contemporary world. Because even in the 1800s, people looked at it as fine arts. That's why you had the photo sessionists. They saw what they were doing as art, not as some craft or not as some, kind of reproduction to be used in advertisement. They saw what they were doing was making photographs as art. So
Mm-hmm.
it was always there, but in the general populace, it wasn't recognized as that. And Sarkowski was really important for that, particularly from a position of power at the Museum of Modern Art. So influence comes out of that too. Even people who like Sanders, August Sanders, the German photographer who was run out of Germany by Hitler, because Hitler was trying to build the myth of the Aryan race. And he was doing common people. He was doing bakers and, just circus workers, for photography. And so he could not stand and be in Germany when they're trying to develop some propaganda machine to talk about Germans as superior. But he was just photographing common people too. I like that. It goes into Lewis Hines and goes into whole other people, even to a tangent like Diane Arbus, she's actually coming out of Lisette Model too. If you look at her early work, it looks very much like Model's work too. Where she's not shying away from people who aren't glamorous or beautiful. In fact, she, unlike Modell, is only focusing on that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting that you talk about Sorbonne, because Sean Walker, who's also a member of Kamoinge, kind of always talks about how how Kamoinge is was his Sorbonne, was his education and sort of how photography could be a fine art. So
Right.
could you talk a little bit about at what point in all of that, are you going to school, you know, being a teenager, making photographs, then going to college for it, then graduating? At what point did you get introduced?
I didn't go to college for it. You know, initially I went to college for medicine.
Oh, wow.
Because when I went to art high for 3 years, but the fourth year I was supposed to graduate, but my parents took me out of there because they felt that I would get a better academic education in a school called Weequahic. And Weequahic in Newark was at one time one of the top schools in the country. So they sent me there, but it was also my introduction to a kind of institutionalized racism when I went from Arts High to Weequahic, when you see the kind of difference at Weequahic. But but also I was supposed to go to school for medicine. First of all, I didn't go to school when I first got out of high school. I was gonna just work and do whatever I felt like doing. But then it ended up being, I said, I cannot spend working in a furniture store for the rest of my life. So let me go to college, you know, let me change my mind. And you know, but I decided to go to school, and that's when I decided I was pre-med. But also I come from like a family of doctors. My grandfather was a doctor, my father's a doctor. My mother was in med school when she eloped with my father, you know, so there was a whole tradition. I think my parents wanted us to be doctors, my brother, my sister, myself, but we were saved because my sister went to med school. So we didn't have to do it. My brother and I didn't have to do it. We were spared the kind of family responsibility. You know, so. But then, and I went to, when I went to Lincoln University for a year, then I transferred to Columbia. And at Columbia, I majored in philosophy and religion. You know, but I finally left after a few years. I graduated. And then after that, I was hanging out in the street. Well, I'm not hanging out in the street. I was just working, and I worked at I married Baraka, you know, and I met him in the jazz clubs. That's one of the problems I had at Columbia, is that I lived in the village and I lived across down the street from the 5 Spot. And you'd have Monk there for a month, and you'd have Charles Mingus there for a month. Why would I go to school? You know what I mean? Like Sean talks about it, the Sorbonne. That's my Sorbonne. The 5 Spot was Monk for a month and Mingus for a month too. And they were two of my favorite musicians too. So, but in there, I met Baraka, and because he used to live around the corner in Cooper Square, and so he invited me to come to a concert they were doing for the school they were opening in Harlem. The school turned out to be the Black Arts. It was part of the Black Arts Repertory Theater. And after he moved uptown, we worked at the Black Arts for a summer. But it was interesting because I was curating at the Black Arts. I curated a photographic show. And then Sean told me, because I don't know if you know this, Sean has saved every strip of paper he's ever passed through in his life. So I mean,
I've seen his file drawers.
Right. That's also he sold it to with the Congress, or not Congress, but one department of the government bought his collection. Right. You know, but we were talking one day, and I said, oh yeah, I was at the Black Arts. He said, oh yeah, I was in a photo show at the Black Art. And so I said, oh, that was funny because I was the curator of that show. And he said, well, you know, he named all the Kamoinge members that were in the show. Now this is 65, and I didn't know them. So it's really funny that I already worked with them before that, but didn't even know it. And then after that, I was after working at the Black Arts, I was going to visit a friend who I met at the Black Arts, or an editor and a poet, Bob Hamilton. He was, I think, initially from San Francisco or Oakland, and he lived on the Bowery. And so I went to visit him, and I bumped into another guy named Jimmy Manis. Jimmy Manis is also, I don't know if you can see the picture, see the guy in the white hat?
Yeah.
That's Jimmy Manis. I bumped into Jimmy in the street, and we just became friends, and we were talking. And so he walked me around the village, took me to visit a friend of his, Marzette Watts, who lived at 27 Cooper Square, where Baraka used to live, and where Archie Shepp, another famous musician, lived. And I ended up living there also, which is really fun. I ended up there, you know, 2 decades later, I ended up living in the same building, you know. And so he introduced me, and then he asked me, what are you doing? I said, well, I was working as a medical photographer at the time. And so he asked me, did I want to go to film school? So I said, sure. So he introduced me to Robert Sardek, who was head of the film school at NYU. And then I showed him a portfolio, and he gave me a scholarship to go to the film school. And then in the film school, I met Lou Draper. Now, obviously, I'd met Lou before, but I didn't remember it because I had Lou in a show that we did at the Black Art. But Lou and I became close friends. He was one of my closest friends from working with him at NYU's Graduate School of Film and Television. you know, but Lou and I would go out shooting together at times just for work we were doing for Paul Caponegro's class. You know. But he was also so serious about photography and so incredibly attached to the craft, but also to excellence, but also to some kind of vision about art and doing what he did as art. So it was really influential to me and just taking it seriously, more seriously. Oh yeah, I'm a photographer. I got a camera around my neck, you know, that kind of thing. But he was an artist. And that's exactly what he did. And he just had the kind of discipline in terms of his photography to do that. And then you realize it later on when you look at Lou's notes, how deeply involved he always was. How he would keep notes in everything he did. He'd make projects to go photograph. He'd do studies of, say, Cartier-Bresson's work too. But we all had been influenced by a lot of different photographers, and particularly Lou and I, because of the courses with Sarkowski, and then we got really familiar with a lot of people in photo history. So it was Cartier-Bresson, of course, who was an influence. But Bresson is also interesting because he actually was a kind of adjunct member of Kamoinge. You know, he came by and not joined, but came to meetings and hung out. And he was the one who, I think, who introduced him to the publisher of Camera magazine. You know, so there was also an influence by him. But also for me, it was Andre Cortez, who was one of my favorite photographers. But I mean, but for everybody in the group liked Bresson and Cortez and Eugene Smith, and Lou used to work for Eugene Smith too. So these are all our people influenced. But we're also influenced by Roy D. Carrabba, who was also a friend, and also influenced by Adja Cowan's friend, Gordon Parks. You know, right. Gordon and Adja were very, very close. And I think Gordon was really supportive of Adja when he was a young photographer trying to get work.
Right.
So I mean, that's actually how I met, became involved with Kamoinge, with meeting Lou at NYU, and then Lou later inviting me to join the group. I think he invited me around 70, but there's some confusion with that because they think I joined in 72. I thought I joined earlier. They think I joined in 72, but I don't remember coming to meetings before that. You know, so okay. When this picture, well, I mean 70, but I think I came before that. But the picture in backwards was 1972.
Okay, so you were definitely there in 1972.
It was also 29. You can see the difference. You can see me in the background. I was also 29 without any gray hair.
So was the Black Arts, was that your first foray into curating?
No. I was curating in high school. You know,
oh, wow.
I had friends, Florian Jenkins and Barbara Fudge, who were, they had been at Artside before me and then moved to East Orange and opened a gallery in East Orange. And I curated there too. I did a show for them there, you know, a few other things there. But it's really funny because curating is inseparable from photographing. You know, it's anytime you put together a portfolio, you're curating. Anytime you look at somebody's work and help put it together, you know, you might not be formally into an exhibit, but the process of curating is already taking place. You know, so it's not wasn't distant from what I was doing in the first place.
Gotcha. So then, how did you get involved with the Studio Museum in Harlem? Because you were there.
A Black Arts collection. It was again a Black Arts collection.
Okay.
You know, there's some confusion in there also too, because there I met Ed Spriggs. Ed was a photographer and a filmmaker, but he was also a writer, and he talked about photography. He would frequent the Black Arts, and we became friends. You know, and in fact, I just talked to another friend I met through the Black Arts, Valerie Maynard. You know, and she was one of the artists working around. She worked for Liberator magazine as an illustrator, as an artist for them too. And this is all in the early and mid 60s. And I talked to her yesterday about her working for doing that kind of work, and then how all of a sudden we both have shows up. She has a show at the Baltimore Museum, a retrospective, and we have that show at Virginia Museum, now moving to the Whitney. What was really funny, so as soon as we both get shows, we end up getting a pandemic that shuts down everything in the country. So it was just, I don't know if we were laughing or commiserating, you know, but it was really funny just to talk to her about it. But I met her at the Black Arts also, but I met Ed Spriggs at the Black Arts. And then after I got out of film school at NYU, Ed asked me, did I want to come to the Studio Museum and teach filmmaking? Actually, I always thought I went there to curate too, but it turns out I didn't. When I look at the records, you know, I told Ed one time, you know, I did this show for you. He said, you didn't do a show for me. And then I looked at when doing all the process of having my bios done, I found out he was right, that I did the show for a later administrator. But I worked at the Studio Museum teaching filmmaking, you know. And then when I left the Studio Museum, I went back to Columbia to study religion and philosophy, you know. And again, I left early without a degree, and I don't know what I was doing, but I was visiting the museum, and I was talking to the woman who was the curator there, and she asked me, her name was Patricia Moment Bell. you know. And so she asked me, what was I doing? I said, oh, well, I do this and I do that, and I also curate, because I was just visiting artists in residence who were friends. And so she said, well, would you like to join the museum? Would you like to come here and curate photography? So I said, sure. So they created a position for me. It was the James Van Der Zee curator of photography, film, and video. But it was Patricia Bowman Bell who suggested and asked me to come on. At the time, the director of the museum was Mary Schmidt Campbell, and the deputy director was Kinshasa Conwell. So
okay.
I came on to do that. And then at the time, it was really funny because I was working with, they asked me one time to help curate the artist in residence. But I picked this guy, Charles Abramson, and David Hammonds, and Jorge Rodriguez. And but David and Charles were contrarians, so I was never asked again. And if they would do installation, and in the installation they put candles, and then Mary and Kinshasa said, "You can't have candles in the damn museum; it's dangerous." So every installation they did from there on in would have candles. They were those kind of people. So I was never asked to do it again. But that was the end. Again, I introduced them to a lot of the contemporary work, but also because of working in a museum, all the young artists, all the young people, and all the activities going on there because of Ed. And I met all the photographers because Ed invited Buford and Kamoinge and all the other groups to come in and do work there. So.
Yeah, I mean, especially a studio museum because their residency program is.
Yeah, but I always tell people that's like cheating. It's like you're the only program that you pay as an artist to come and make art. So you have the choice of every artist in the country who wants to go there. No, at least every artist of color whose their mission is to help serve. But I think it's a wonderful thing. But they really look at the people who come through there. David and Allison and Charles Abramson, just incredible. The top-notch people in the world. Kayinde, all the top contemporary. One of the artists in residence was Jackie Holmes, and she was a printmaker and a paper maker. She made paper. You can joke with them, you don't have to make paper, you can go buy it. They sell it all, every store is selling some paper, but she was into really Japanese paper making and doing incredible things. But she wanted me to meet her friend who was at the Schomburg, who was a photo specialist. It was Deborah Willis. And so when I met Deborah, I really liked her and I loved what she was doing. I loved her expertise. So in the first 2 shows I did for the Studio Museum, when I went back, I asked her to co-curate with me. So we did Harlem Heyday together. So it was, Debbie and myself talking about James Van Der Zee's work.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of ironic because Van Der Zee never saw his work as art. He saw his photography as craft, as a way of paying the bills. He saw his art as playing the violin, as music. So I mean, it was tragic in one sense too, but in one sense he was right. If you compare his work and say in the direction of art, if you compare it to the work that was going on of Stieglitz and Steichen and all the people going on at the same time, he wasn't doing art that they were doing. He was doing something else. He was doing a kind of craft for the society of Harlem. And when you see in his early works, the beauty of his work is really the beauty of the people. It's how they saw themselves and how they presented themselves for the camera. And a lot of times that whole kind of look, that kind of beautiful dressed up look, these were poor people who didn't have those clothes. He had a rack in his studio where they would come and dress up and put a tuxedo on when they didn't own a tuxedo, but it was in the studio as a costume to dress up in. Although some people did have tuxedos, some people came in ready for that too, but a lot of people didn't. So you're looking at in Van Der Zee's work, you're looking at the aspiration of the people. You're looking at how they saw themselves, and not just how they saw themselves economically, but how they projected themselves in the future, what they wanted to be, what they aspired to be. So.
Right.
So that's an incredible historical record for that too.
Yeah. So that show was am I correct, it was in 1982? Are
you asking me?
Yeah, I am asking you.
I don't have a clue when that show was, It has to be somewhere around there.
Okay.
No, it might be earlier. It might be earlier. It's whenever they moved. It was the first show when they moved from the old location on 5th Avenue to the location on 125th Street.
Okay. Well, do you remember what was going on at the time? I mean, can you talk about why it was important for you to do that show at that moment? Was there anything going on?
Yeah, because the museum was moving and there was going to be a grand opening of the new space. And it was Mary's vision, though, to take it from 5th Avenue. Even think about 5th Avenue as a back street. When 5th Avenue on 125th Street compared to 125th Street and Lenox, it was a back street. The real thoroughfare is 125th Street and Lenox. And to move the museum to that location, a new location, was an incredible bit of visionary movement by Mary Schmidt Campbell. So it was a grand opening and a celebration of that. But I think the museum also been criticized for not identifying with Harlem. So I think part of the aspiration of the exhibits were to show that we were a part of Harlem, that the Studio Museum was the Studio Museum in Harlem, you know. So,
Right.
but if you know the history of the museum was actually established some kind of liberal project. You know, it's a project by the people from the modern. And it was a throwaway thing. It's really the reason it's called Studio Museum because it wasn't supposed to be a museum. It was supposed to be artist studios, and the modern people from the modern helped put it together and pay for it. But Ed's vision was to make it a museum. So he's the one who decided to start having exhibits. Tom Floyd, I think, was the first, Tom Lloyd was the first director. And because of his disassociation with the people in Harlem, at least people in Harlem thought that, which I don't think was fair, you know, but also because he did a kind of abstract sculpture, people were saying he had no connection to the art and the movement of Harlem. So he was replaced, and the replacement was Ed Spriggs. You know, and Ed made it much more community-based, much more interested in who was living in Harlem too. And then I think Mary's aspiration was to make it a more international museum in terms of how it served and in terms of the standards they wanted to represent. It's not that Ed didn't have the same standards, but she wanted standards that would be recognized by the white art world, I think. You know, so they moved to a new location, which was an incredible move. And they're doing that right now too. They're expanding right now to make it a much larger institution too. But our show, Harlem Heyday, was to do part of that. I can't remember who the other show was with it because it was 3 shows that opened at the same time. And one was Harlem Heyday, the photographs of James Van Der Zee. You know, so. And it was curated by Deborah and myself. And the next photographic show was Introspection by Tony Barbosa. It's like you can't get away from Kamoinge members. You try to avoid them and you can't really can't. You can't do it. But it's really funny because and again, that was co-curated by Deborah and myself. You know, so.
Okay.
And then the third show I did was called The Sound I Saw, the jazz photographs of Roy DeCarava.
Okay.
And it's funny how it happened because Roy was a friend. He was a friend from the Kamoinge days. He was a friend from the Studio Museum. He was a friend from just respecting him and being a kind of inspiration in photography. So it's funny because I was been working on the show with him and we didn't have any funds for it. And I walked out in the hall one day and Mary was walking down the hall with a guy whose name I cannot remember. But I recognized him from basketball when I saw him, we just started talking. We talked about basketball down there. You know, I didn't play because I couldn't play on that level, but I just saw him playing. I told him where I knew him from. And he said, "So what do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm curating. I'm curating. I curate photography, film, and video." He said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, we're working on a show with Roy DeCarava." He said, "We'll pay for it." Turns out he was a vice president at Chase Bank, and he was. But you know, I just knew him from the basketball court. You know, so. And so, but he said, "Yeah, you know, a few years ago he did our annual report. So anything you want to do with him, I'm ready to do." So it was, and he just had the money like that. It was just paid like that, because I happened to walk out in the hall at the time he was walking by. You know, so I invented the title though, James Van Der Zee, curator of photography, film, and video. I wanted all those in there. You know, part of it was to take because we had the Van Der Zee collection at the time, and it was in total disarray, but also it was in dangerous disarray. You know, because the Van Der Zee had nitrate negatives. I don't know if you know about nitrate negatives. Nitrate film can spontaneously combust and destroy everything too. So interwoven with, he had 59,000 pieces. So I had to go through every single piece. Most of the really beautiful work I thought was from like the 1990s and the 20s and some in the 30s. But all the other stuff was basically passport photographs, you know, like the headshot if you had to get a taxi license or, you know, that type of thing. So, but we had to go through everything and take out all the dangerous negatives, and we took all the dangerous stuff up to Rochester Institute of Technology, you know, and the Kodak. It was the Kodak Museum, but it was an institute associated with Kodak in Rochester. But they were archivists who took care of collections that had dangerous things like nitrate negative. You know, so we took them out and we put them in some kind of sealed boxes that didn't have oxygen, so they wouldn't. You know, burst into flames and destroy everything around it. So, but we had to go through everything, and it was 59,000 pieces of work. You know, so you got to know Van Der Zee's work kind of. Well, you know, it's really funny because that was only half the work. The other half was thrown out in the street. You know, when he was evicted from one of his studios.
Yeah. So was there anything in his collection? I know you said that it was, you know, mostly passport photos. Was there anything else in the collection that you didn't expect to be there that most people in the general public don't really know about his work?
Yeah, there were some pieces, you know, there was a kind of practice with photographing dead babies, you know, photographing the dead, but that turned out to be a standard practice in a lot of societies, you know, in a lot of European countries too. When the baby died young, they put the baby, dressed the baby up and put him in a cradle and took a beautiful portrait of them for, you know, kind of remembrance. And he did a lot of those like that too. And that's closest he came to the kind of photosessionist work where he was floating angels or floating little babies over, you know, over some kind of scene, you know. So it was where he was doing multiple images on one thing. And in fact, I don't know if you know Camille Billups. Camille Billups, she's a great artist. She was an artist, had the Hatch Billups collection. She and Jim Hatch opened an archive that studied artists. They did a few hundred interviews with artists, you know, and published them all. And all of her collection is at Emory right now. But she did a book with Van Der Zee. But Van Der Zee, I don't think he quite understood what she was doing, what she was playing with. She did a book called The Harlem Book of the Dead. And it was those photographs. It was the photographs of the little kids in their coffins and, you know, angels floating over their heads and flowers all around the corners. But she was just playing with that imagery and playing with the Book of the Dead. And, you know, even though it's inappropriately named the Book of the Dead, she's just doing that because of everybody, it had a kind of resonance when you talked about the Book of the Dead and using those photographs of that. So they were actually published too. That's the only thing that really surprised me too. But also what's not surprised me, what I got to understand was the quality of life in Harlem at the time. You know, and you just read it in some kind of sociological text. When you look at how people dressed and look at how they came in and how they presented themselves too, you realize a lot of people are rural from the South or from the Caribbean, but they come up with a certain incredible intention for improving their lives too. And also, I didn't know that Van Der Zee was the official photographer for Marcus Garvey, the United Negro Improvement Association. So you see all these Garvey pictures of him too. You know, the pictures you see of Garvey were basically taken by Van Der Zee. You know, so.
Wow, I did not know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's incredible work. Someone could have do a book of just Garvey's Van Der Zee images of Garvey.
Yeah. So kind of along those lines, I think something that we think about at PCPP when we're working with an archive is building a narrative around the work, especially a mature collection, someone's life's work. You know, that's something you think about. And I would imagine that's very similar to what you do as a curator when you're putting, especially like a large solo.
Well, actually, I've come up with a kind of theorem for that. If you hear somebody say it, they stole it from me.
Okay.
No, one image is a statement or a constellation of statements, maybe with a dominant theme. Two images is a conversation. What are these two images saying to each other? More than two images, three or more is a narrative. What's the narrative? It helps you curate. I mean, that's really just simple, but it's one thing that helps you understand how you develop a narrative. It helps you how you can switch narratives in images too. The association of images might be because of some kind of sociological theme. They can also be because of the way the artists use kind of graphic variants. How do they use vectors in their work? And that also makes another association. So there are all different kinds of association. But if you're clear that you're developing a narrative, you can understand what the narrative is. You know, why do you think these two pieces go together? What do they have in common, or what do they not have in common? So I mean, it just helps you as you put an exhibit together too. But,
so yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think your experience of curating the show of his work helped you serve as his archivist as well? Do you think there's overlap there in those two roles?
Of course, yeah. It's just a kind of cumulative knowledge of what you're interacting with, you know, visual stuff. And it's funny how that helped in film school, because I didn't know anything about vectors. I'd use them. Anybody who uses photography uses vectors. And it's a kind of technical term used in film, which is really stolen from filmmaking and from cinematography. And there are like three basic vectors. There's graphic vectors, like a strong line moving a certain way is a graphic vector. And it leads you into something. It might lead you into an image, like going railroad tracks, disappearing into a horizon. You put something in the middle of that, those two lines lead you into that person. Those are graphic vectors. But there's also index vectors, like a face looking a certain way, an arrow pointing in a certain direction, a finger pointing. Those are index vectors, you know, indicating some kind of information. And then there are motion vectors, like a car speeding. You know, but they all, it's a term stolen from physics, which talks about lines of energy. You know, and it's just different types of energy, whether it's visual energy or graphic energy, or whether it's social energy and the index vectors, or whether it's motion vectors and some kind of knowledge of information about movement. You know. But all this stuff gets acquired as you go along. It didn't come from doing photography; it came from doing film. But it's still associated with the visual arts too.
So do you still, can you talk about your history with film? Do you still make films?
Yeah, I do. I worked a lot in film, but I worked basically in docs, doing documentary films. Then I did a few features. I worked with Jimmy Manis, again, in the white hat. And we worked in Guyana on one of the films he did. I think it was 1974. And I did sound for him. But the whole crew was basically NYU people, so. It was funny though, because we were telling people in Guyana, I would call them and say, well, do you have batteries? He said, yeah, we got all the batteries. And I said, wait a minute, let me just get every battery I need. And I got all the batteries I needed, and they had none. They just had a basically D cell, but the other batteries they'd never even heard of, because they were specialized batteries used for cameras and used for microphones. So they didn't even know about them. So we just brought everything down there too. And then I worked on another film called Vagabond Grand Chimie in Martinique. It was another feature done by Patrick Valet, a young Martinican film director. But I worked on a lot of different docs. I did a doc with Jimmy Manis too on Tom Fieldings, a painter from Brooklyn, who was also in Guyana at the time we went to Guyana. But actually I'm still working in films. I work in film right now. We're working on a film on 3 photographers from Newark. And one is me. One is John Pinderhughes, a photographer who used to be my neighbor in Newark, and Amin Ankra, who's a photographer from Newark who lived around the corner from me also. So we are just like 3 photographers from Newark, and we have a writer with it who's Richard Wesley, who's also from Newark. Richard Wesley is a well-known screenplay writer and a film writer, but he teaches writing at NYU too. He teaches film. He's head of the screenplay writing department at NYU.
So could you talk a little bit about how African spirituality, especially in the Americas, underscores not only your work as a curator, but also as a photographer?
Oh my God. Does it? I don't know. It might do that. But I don't know, African spirituality also, it would be like saying, how does studying Zen influence your life? It has everything to do with your life. It has everything to do with it, because the kind of cosmologies of African religions end up influencing the world you live in. Are shaping the world you live in too. I did a whole series called Portions and Proportions, a photograph called Portions and Proportions, where I was exploring the space between when something is a location and when something is an object. How do you get to that very fine line before, if you go in too close, you're photographing the object. If you go back too far, you're only photographing the location. How do you get to the place where it's both, where the photograph observes both too? And I was talking to a famous Congolese scholar, Foucault, who we were just talking about that kind of thing in African philosophy, and African ideas. And he talked about there are different ways of looking at African cosmologies and African systems, because the Bakongo had a writing system. The writing system is called Bidimbu, but they also have another writing system, which is called Simsu. Bidimbu is actually graphic writing. It's a writing system. It influences the Americas. It goes into writing systems in Cuba, in the Congo religion of Cuba called Palo. The writing system is called firmas. And it just means signature in Spanish. But also in Abacoa in Cuba, they have a writing system that comes out of Cross River, Africa. And it's called, in Cuba, it's called Anaforuana. Anaforuana is that, but in Africa it's called Insibidi, But then there's and then also there's a writing system in Dahomey called Veve. But Veve is just concentric circles. And they have the same term in Haiti, but that whole system, when it hits Congolese culture, even though it comes from different places, it explodes into this kind of visual language that's really strong. But it's that specific graphic writing. But the Bakongo also have a different writing system. But it's a writing system where you read nature. And that very much influenced the way I looked at Portions and Proportions. It's a writing system called Simsu, that the way like a river and a tree and a landscape come together, that's a writing system. You can read the writing system. One day I was with Foucault and we were just talking about location. He said, well, some places you can't live because the locations are dangerous. I said, well, how can you tell? He said, you can read the grass, because the grass grows differently. It looks differently in areas where there's radiation. And it also grows differently in areas where there's a graveyard. So, but again, it was very much like someone from New Zealand, you know, someone who represents a kind of Polynesian culture, or Rapa Nui culture, who can actually read the waves in the water. We can't do it, but they can. They're so skilled that they don't need the stars to navigate. They can navigate by looking at the waves in the water. They can see how far away landmass is, you know, just by looking at the waves. Well, that's the same way in terms of reading nature, that people, basically people who are illiterate have that much more developed than people who are literate. They're reading the landscape, they're reading their environment too. And there's a beautiful book about that called Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, where he's talking about someone who is illiterate is not living in our universe. He's living in a universe he reads that we can't even read. We don't even know what's going on. And they're seeing all these things in the universe like that too. But that also influenced the way I was trying to do those photographs in portion and proportion. The whole understanding that there's a language in these objects, there's a language in shapes that say something because it's our own language. And how do you use that visually? So I've always shot everything. I always shot black and white and color, you know, in all formats, you know. Yeah. But I remember at one meeting, I showed some work to Herbie Randall, who is, I think, is a brilliant photographer too. And he looked at the work. He said, "I can't look at it anymore. If I look at it more, I'll throw up." You know, because I think photographers are basically repeating themselves over and over again. And I think you get your point. Once they get the point, you know, that's enough. You know, how much do you want to see at that point? You know, you might say it differently, but you're saying the same thing over again. You're using your graphics and your elements to basically say who you are. You can't do anything but say who you are. So I think Herbie had just able to read it immediately. I said, "I'm sick of this. I don't want another diet of this. I've had enough already." It has nothing to do with beauty or anything else. It's just realizing that you're using a very specific, codified, personalized language. You know, and once you've gotten the language, once you recognize the language, whether you don't want to eat that much of it, you know, and you know whether it's that necessary. So I think artists are always just repeating themselves, because if you're really trying to be as true as you can to your personal vision, it's always you saying it. So if you know, I don't know how many ways you can say something different, but once you get the idea of what's being said, it's what you want to hear over and over again. You know, something.
So what would you say you've been repeating in your photography? What have you been trying to say?
I'm not sure. But I figured that I'd stop. You know, I'm not quite sure. You know who I think who does that all the time too. But he's one of his saving graces is David Hammons, because he always uses humor. David is always funny. You know. So that makes it palatable. You can have that heavy digest of David Hammonisms because it's funny, you know. So yeah. But again, a brilliant kind of visionary too, who can take things and retranslate it into his personal vision. So like portraiture, because it's a chance to. And my goals in portraiture are trying to in a visual kind of graphic language be as complimentary to somebody I like. Because normally I'm doing portraits of people I really care about, you know. So, and I want something that makes them feel fulfilled and makes me feel fulfilled, you know. So, but it's using all the tools, it's using all the graphic tools, it's using colors, using black and white mood and psychology and all that other thing, you know. But again, part of my objective is complementary, and so part of the objective too that was part of Kamoinge was to, in one sense, redeem African American culture. Because I think we exist in a kind of racist, Eurocentric society and a worldview. It's not that it's a living worldview that you have to bump into every time you do anything, because there is a kind of a cultural imperialism that the West has put on the rest of the world, and you're always bumping into it no matter what you do, and it's either validates or invalidates your work, you know. And if you don't address it, you think there's something wrong with your work or your vision, when really it's bumping into the kind of hegemonic view of the world that people inherit through their educational systems too. I remember one time talking to, this was in Paris, I was talking to two friends in Paris. One was from Vietnam, one was from Benin. And the guy from Benin looked up at the guy's wall, and there was a map from Indochina. And he said, "You know, I grew up in Benin using an exact same map." You know, he said, "Yeah, it's the French imperial map." You know, so you realize that even though the one is in Asia, one's in Africa, they've been influenced in terms of their intellect by the same colonial powers. You know? And it's not escapable either. But you have to be conscious that it's there. You can escape it, but you have to be conscious that it's there, that it's a factor. That something that says your work is invalid might be a whole kind of historical thing. I mean, it's really funny. I was reading about that today. I was reading about from historical archaeology, which I don't normally read historical archaeology, but I was reading it because it had the same Congo writing system I was talking about. It's called the Kamoinge. It's a Congo cross. It's a standard cross from the Congo. It's an equilateral cross where all arms are the same length. You know, it just looks like a plus sign. You know, but that's the standard Congo cross. It's also called Kamoinge. And they were finding it all over this pottery from the American South, from the colonial period. And only recently did they realize that Africans made a contribution in that cross is talking about Bakongo cosmology in Central African, in African-based pottery found in colonial America, colonial United States. You know. But the thing that prevented them from seeing is that with these kind of presumptions about Africa, the whole kind of deficit model that we talk about when you think about Africans in the United States in particular, you think those poor Africans, they were enslaved. You know, they didn't have material culture. They couldn't bring it with them. But when you look at it, nobody brought their material culture to the Americas. Nobody brought the Louvre, and nobody brought the British Museum. Everybody brought the same thing they had, and the most they brought was a trunk, you know. But everybody brought the most important thing for reestablishing their culture, and they brought their minds. And so when you look at Africans coming to the Americas, every single enslaved body had a mind. Every single person who came brought history and tradition and religion and philosophy and all that other stuff with them. So when you look at the formation of what we call the Americas now, and the Africans are just as important as Europeans or Native Americans in the formulating of it. But nobody gives them that kind of gives them respect for the contribution they made because they have the deficit model. They think of the only importance being some kind of gross materialism, when it's actually intellectual, it's philosophical, you know. So I mean, that's where you look at American athletics. You know, the athletics in the Americas have been changed by African ideas, but nobody ever said that Africans brought different ideas about how to interact athletically. You know, why is our movement all dance, whether you're in Cuba or Brazil or United States? The idea of introducing dance movement into an engagement. The idea that force against force is stupid. You know, it's all written into the way we work in the athletic arena, but because we're under some kind of racist overlay of Western ideas of what's proper and what's not proper, it's seen as showboating or hot dogging or some kind of pejorative, as opposed to some changing of the nature of the game, reinterpreting how we should interact.
Wow, great. So to close, are there, well, I know you talked about you're working on the film, you know, about Newark. Are there any projects that you're working on, and or are there any current shows you're in, upcoming shows that going on?
Well, now project I'm working on. In fact, I thought I've moved right now. I'm living in a temporary location. I thought I would use this time to get all my images together, but it was just so insane here that I couldn't do it, you know. Yeah. And then it was kind of further complicated by the virus, you know. So I've been trying to structure, put everything together, and I bought all the equipment I need to do it, but the situation is still too unstable to do it. So, but also I've talked to some other curators that were interested in doing a kind of show of myself, a retrospective of my work. You know, so I'm interested in it.
Wonderful.
They will remain nameless so they don't feel entrapped into having to do it. So, you know. So.
And as you said, the Kamoinge Workshop, the Lou Draper show at BMFA will be going.
Well, that film is tied into an exhibit of Newark. You know, we're going to do contemporary photographs of Newark, showing what was important to us in Newark. And, you know, in fact, it's really funny because the mayor of Newark is Baraka's son, Mayor Baraka's son.
Oh, wow.
Ross Baraka. And he's also brilliant. So he might be, he's one of the best mayors in the country, you know, but nobody knows that.
Huh. Wow.
You know, but we haven't presented the idea to him yet. We're just working on it too with some curators and some institutions in Newark, and we've talked to some historians too.